All right. Well, we are going to get started. So, allow me to introduce myself and our other presenters. My name is Eric Carlin. I'm one of the co-founders of Ivy Experience, along with Karan Shah, who's joining us tonight. And also with us is Tori Burke, our Assistant Director of Tutoring and our Accommodations Specialist. And we are here tonight to answer the question, what's next for those of you whose students are finishing ninth grade? And uh, pardon the familiarity of this slide to anyone who's seen any of our other presentations, but we always like framing webinars like this and any presentations we do in person with this idea of focusing on what is in your control, right? Because when we're asking that question of what's next, what we're oftentimes really wondering is, what should I be doing, or what should I be anticipating or expecting? And when you're navigating this high school journey that ultimately leads to the college application and admissions process, there's a lot of factors that are beyond a student and a family's control. And there's no point in us relitigating or listing those now. But we're going to frame tonight around what is in your control. That doesn't mean that everything is urgent right now, and that's what we're here to discuss tonight, to set expectations, ease concerns, and help everyone develop a roadmap and a plan for moving forward. But the things that are in your control, you have your academic grades and rigor, right? How difficult the courses are. And Karan's going to be speaking about this shortly. We have standardized tests, really highlighted by SATs and ACTs, which are getting back in college admissions offices' good graces, not, but how far, were they ever out is a question, and an idea that Tori will explore among other ideas and things related to standardized tests. And then Tori and I are going to chat briefly about letters of recommendation, which are in your control and to an extent, and we're going to talk about how. Extracurricular activities, I'm excited to speak with you about personally. And then something we'll mention briefly at the end, but not belabor, because this is pretty far down the road, are the essays and applications themselves. So with that said, starting with the foremost and most obvious thing is grades. So I'm going to flip this to Karan, who's going to talk with you. And I'm sure a lot of students are in the middle of final seasons now, so this is fresh on everyone's mind. So
Thanks,
Karan,
Eric.
talk
Thanks,
about
Eric. So in terms of grades and rigor, let's just define rigor a little bit first. So rigor is how difficult the courses you are taking throughout your high school. Are they honors classes? Are they accelerated classes? Are they AP classes? I know everyone's just wrapping up freshman year, so a lot of the AP, IB, all that stuff's not immediately in their current like school year schedule, but it might be something they might be considering next year or the year after that. So with that being said, grades are going to be the most important thing colleges look at on the student's entire application. Think of it as the front page of your student's application, in addition to their name, address, email, and all of that. If the application is a folder, it's the front page of the folder. And in this case, admissions officers do judge a book by its cover. They want to see that the student is going to be able to handle the rigors of the college curriculum adequately. And so if the grades aren't what they're looking for, oftentimes a lot of what we'll talk about later today in terms of extracurriculars, letters of recommendation, they may not even get to those parts of the application if the grades aren't there. So it's really important, especially as we wrap up this year, to continue to do well, end the year well, do well on your finals. But let's talk about how grades went this year. So there's kind of two ways grades could have gone this year, right? First is everything went great. My student did really well, or I did really well, and I really want to continue that throughout high school, right? Like if you started out with getting all good grades and all your classes great, we'll talk about challenging yourself a little bit more in future years on the next slide. But continue to build off that momentum. Keep those good grades going. Like the colleges will want to see that you maintain your level of success in your classes, even as maybe your courses are getting more difficult. difficult, right? But what if this year didn't go well, right? Like I was a transition to high school was a little bit difficult. Maybe the course load was a little bit tougher than we anticipated, right? What if it didn't go well? Okay, well, first, let's make sure we try to wrap up the year well, right? Eric was alluding to his finals his freshman year and how he still remembers them, right? And like, let's finish the year strong with these finals. If you know your finals aren't until the end of May, possibly till June, start studying now, right? It's going to cover the whole year or half year, depending on your courses. And so set yourself up so it's not just the week before finals that you're studying. So at least whatever portion of your grade the finals is, and it's usually a pretty big portion, like you make sure you end the year kind of on the right note. With that being said, colleges also want to see and are a little bit more forgiving of slightly weaker grades in freshman year as opposed to other years. So if, hey, freshman year grades aren't exactly what we anticipated they're going to be, okay, well, let's work on making sure we're improving next year in 10th grade, right? And if we get the grades we want in 10th grade, now we work on adding rigor in 11th grade. So that upward trajectory is also something that colleges can work with, especially when it comes to your students' grades. So sophomore year is going to be a nice little reset, and we can kind of reevaluate where we're going from there. So now, with those grades and how those grades went this year, I know a lot of you probably went through course selection back in January, February, maybe even March. But this is a good time to, before the school year ends, kind of reevaluate your course selection and make sure you're taking the right classes next year. What does that mean? Well, one, if you did say the first year, half of the year didn't go well, but you were really able to improve, do you want to maybe try to jump into the honors class next year that you aren't necessarily signed up for right now? On the flip side, like if you are signed up for honors class and the second half of this year has been really difficult, right? Take the first couple weeks and months of next year, like September, October, to decide, is this the right class for me, right? As I mentioned, colleges want to see that you're getting the best grades in the classes that you can handle. So if you have the start of your 10th grade year and you're like, hey, this Algebra 2 class is really, really difficult, it's affecting me in all the other classes that I'm taking, it might be time to be honest and say, hey, maybe I move down to the regular class or move down to a different level, right? So that you are taking the classes that you can handle, and especially you don't have one class kind of affecting your grades across the board. With that being said, I know it's only ninth grade and students haven't made their college list yet, and they're not going to for a couple of years, as we'll talk about a little bit later today. But if your student does kind of have those high achieving goals, right? They want to eventually apply to some of the most competitive programs in the country, some of the most competitive colleges, then they're going to have to take the most difficult courses that your high school offers. So at some high schools, that's honors classes. At some high schools, that's AP classes. The APs might not start at 11th grade, depending on your high school. But if there are opportunities in 10th grade to take those certain AP courses and your high school allows it, oftentimes it's kind of like AP Computer Science is a common one students take before 11th grade, where if they have those opportunities and they're going to be looking at those really competitive programs, they're going to want to take those more difficult courses. So with that said, like, how do we do to kind of like, what do we do this year? We're kind of saying what's next, right? Well, what's next is, hey, we have a month of school left. Let's finish strong, as I mentioned, right? Do well on your finals. If your class has a project or a paper as a replacement for a final, make sure that you work really hard to do the best you can in those particular, on those particular assignments and on those particular exams. Also, reevaluate this year when the school year is done, right? Figure out what worked this year. Hey, I did really well. I managed my schedule well. I managed my extracurriculars well. Well, then continue that through next year, right? As you move through high school, your classes are going to get more difficult. You're going to be more involved in your extracurriculars, possibly even have some leadership. So what will you have to do to kind of adjust to say, hey, now instead of my club meeting for an hour a week, I have to be there for an hour and a half because I'm setting up and taking a part for the meeting, right? How are you going to factor those things in your schedule, and what adjustments are you going to make next year? And then finally, with your, like, in terms of 10th grade, figure out what are the classes that are going to be really meaningful to you, right? Like this is, as we get into 10th grade, 11th grade, students can begin to start to figure out what they may potentially want to study down the line. This is not to say they need to decide what their potential major is going to be at the end of 10th grade or 11th grade, but at the same time, they need to figure out what classes they do truly enjoy. What is something they want to pursue more? What are some of their intellectual interests that they may decide to pursue outside of the classroom? So setting yourself up to evaluate what you actually like academically is going to be an important part of 10th grade. With that said, and the importance of all of this sort of thing, and why are we talking about it first? Eric's going to talk about extracurricular activities, and we're going to talk about letters of recommendation, all these other parts of the application, right? And why are grades the most important? And why is it important to do well? Because they're the front page of your folder. Well, let's look at how high school GPA has kind of gone for a lot of colleges throughout like the last couple of years. So with that said, so for those of you who are in Pennsylvania, University of Pittsburgh is one of kind of the two major state schools that are in Pennsylvania that a lot of our students end up applying to, right? And so if you look at the chart that's here, almost 70% of students who went to Pitt. And so the common data set, just for a little bit of context, every college puts out information about the students that are admitted every year and attend. And so the percentage of students who had a GPA of 4.0 or above was 70% of their students. So 70% of the students with weighting, you get some schools give extra points for honors, AP, IB, those sorts of classes. They had GPAs over 4.0. So basically over like an A in almost every class. So this is why grades are important, because everyone is kind of showing up with these higher grades. Because as you'll see on the next chart that we have, grade inflation is up across the board. If you look at the percentage of students who are going into a percentage of freshmen, right, at four-year universities who had an A average in high school, if you look in 2022, it was over 80%. 80% of students are applying to colleges with straight A's. That's not to say that a B in in 10th grade has sunk you and we're at the end of the world, right? This is the idea here is to show that you need to continue to work hard throughout high school, challenge yourself because everyone else is, and grade inflation is up across the board. So with that said, I'm going to hand it off to Eric, and he's going to talk about the other part of your ninth grade year, which you're probably involved right now, which is the activities and clubs.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Absolutely. And these are so important. You know, there's really two lenses through which we can look at the importance of extracurricular activities. One is from a college admissions perspective, which, you know, when you think about those slides that Karan just spoke about with, you know, grade inflation and what it has become in the past decade, especially, the word that I always think about is distinguishing, right? And I think something that, you know, we hear other words when it comes to applications and activities and essays, right? We hear things like unique or creative, right? Or new or different. But distinguishing to me is the most important word, right? Because if you're there with the same GPA as 70% of all the other students applying, right? If not 80, if not 90 at probably, you know, or more at some of the top universities, that the grades are still essential, but they aren't distinguishing anymore. Extracurricular activities are the one thing from the moment you step foot in high school that are in your control that to us are more of those distinguishing factors. There's another reason extracurriculars are so important too. And that's because they're a source of happiness during high school and purpose and life, right? You're not just doing high school to go to class and do homework and do research projects. A huge part of the high school experience and personal growth are extracurricular activities, right? And that's why when we're talking about what colleges want to see in extracurriculars, is that they want to see that you're using your personal time in productive and personally meaningful ways. And, you know, while the ultimate goal is depth, you know, over breadth, when we're talking about when you submit that application and ultimately what you're showing, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that hopefully freshman year was a year for your students of curiosity. Maybe they came into high school and they said, you know, I've never tried this thing before. Let me look into it. Or, wow, I didn't even know there was a club for this academic interest. Let me try that. And they started to dabble in different things, But, and I'll probably be touching on this again, in a few slides when we really talk about that what's next. But really, what's next is we start to look towards sophomore year is, do you need to be a specialist sophomore year and have everything figured out? Absolutely not. But this is a great opportunity to speak as a family and for students to self-reflect. What went well this year? What brought them happiness? Or what were extracurriculars they did that didn't bring them any happiness or fulfillment or, joy or sense of community or purpose whatsoever? Get rid of those. You don't need those. Colleges aren't going to hold it against you if you dropped from robotics club or the rowing team after one season or 1 year, right? They'll hold it much more against you if you go through the motions of something. And then by the time you submit the application, they can clearly tell and look at your file like, this student didn't really care about this. They were probably just doing this because they thought it looked good for college. So whether it's athletic or creative talents, intellectual pursuits, social justice, civic engagement, community service, leadership, mentorship, personal interests, curiosities, and hobbies, those things count too, right? Whatever you're doing with your spare time, start going down a path of depth versus breadth, or at least be integrative about your different interests and ideas. And that brings, me to really one of my favorite words of all time. It's not a word in the English language, it's from Japanese. It's called ikigai. And there's no direct translation to the English language, but really, I think it's such a beautiful illustration of how students should be looking at and approaching their extracurricular pursuits. They want to think about what is the intersection of what do I enjoy doing, what I'm really good at, and what the world needs. That intersection is Ikigai. Ikigai is an amazing starting point to what activities should I pursue. And, I think a really important point is that you're not limited to school clubs. When we're talking about extracurricular activities, especially in ninth grade, when students are too young for internships and work, overwhelmingly, not totally, but overwhelmingly, and they don't have a car, so it's harder to get off, the high school campus and do other things. It's just a little bit tougher. There's more restrictions in ninth grade. But, the idea is that you aren't limited to activities that are school sponsored. They're not just clubs. You can do anything. And right now, looking forward, the idea is to dream big and do what you love, not what you think is impressive or what colleges want to see, but do things that are really matterful to you, that really excite you. And because here's the thing, right? Better people are better applicants, right? The more authentic you are, without ever thinking about the word college, you will naturally be a better college applicant because admissions officers are people. People accept other people at the end of the day, and people get excited by genuine, authentic, real people. They're not going to get excited. There's that movie from years ago, Admission, which I know is supposed to be a comedy. It's not that funny. It has Tina Fey and Paul Rudd, so it really should have been funny. I don't even remember everything, but Tina Fey, she's an admissions officer at Princeton. And there's one scene that's always stuck with me. And she's going through application files. And as she opens each one up, the student pops into the room with her. That's the effect you want to have. And that's what extracurriculars can do, right? They can make you come to life. Um, but an important point I want to make right now is this. That idea of coming to life, being authentic, it sounds like an easy thing, right? Be authentic, be yourself. And yet, it's way harder to be authentic in activities than it is to be basic, right? For lack of any, just as a contrasting word, right? it's so much easier to just sign up for clubs and do what your friends are doing and do what's familiar, where the paths have already been blazed. Am I saying you need to start your own club or initiative? No. Am I saying you have to go do something incredible that's never been done before? Absolutely not. But, a moment ago, I mentioned that idea of maybe you find ways to combine different interests or values, things that are important to you, right? Or maybe you want to team up with something, some other people, or maybe you do want to start something, right? Um, the idea that I used in a TEDx talk that I gave several years ago, which I used for years in webinars and presentations like this, is this idea of, what if a student wants to start a rock band in the garage, right? I mean, first of all, it's an incredible thing because you're showing initiative and creativity and leadership and teamwork. You can play community gigs around town for community service. You can get paid gigs and be a job. You can teach music lessons to kids in town. That's another job and mentorship. You obviously have musical talent. Maybe you write your own songs. There's so many incredible things you're displaying, but it takes initiative and drive and ingenuity to do something like that. And you can take anything, right? Whether you like birds or hockey or writing or science and chemistry, it doesn't matter what you love, right? How, this is a great moment to sit down with your student and say, like, what would you really love to do moving forward? And how can we make that happen? And that really is the big what's next here, right? When Karan and I, and I'll speak about this in a moment, are working with students and meeting with students and families at what we call personal advising meetings, where we meet with eighth, ninth, and 10th grade families. And it's really like a dream counseling session where we talk about mapping extracurricular and academic goals. When meeting with students, one question that I love to ask is, I say, okay, so let's talk about all your activities. Let's list everything. And then I say, before, what do you love? I say, what are things that aren't bringing you any fulfillment or joy? Let's get rid of those. Now that we got rid of that, now let's talk about a plan forward. Let's dream big. Let's think of things. Let's go beyond the school sponsored club fair. And a great way to start and build off this momentum and continue to grow is looking at the summer after ninth grade. If you guys don't have plans yet, anyone listening to this, there's still time to have conversations as a family, with us, you know, with anyone you know and trust. Make a plan for the summer. Use it. It's a great time to discover yourself and do things and really lay foundation and build momentum for the fall. And at the same time, you don't need to wait for the club fair in the fall. Start developing a plan now so that by the time the school year starts, all you have to do is execute to do what you want. And that's something, again, we love helping students with this, right? So Karan and I are the two people who meet with students and parents for these personal advising meetings. We meet all throughout the year for any number of topics, course selection, academic planning, and goal setting. How do we explore a personal academic interest that may evolve into a college major? But for activities, we love helping students come up with ideas and how to think about their resume and doing it in a truly meaningful and personal way. So with that said, you can reach out to us anytime if you want to schedule one of those meetings. But before we get to SAT and ACT prep, which is going to be a big topic, and I know for a lot of families looking ahead towards 10th grade, this is like the big looming new thing. But we're just going to do a pre-palette cleanser and talk for just a moment about letters of recommendation, which students aren't writing them, Tori, right? They can't write the letters themselves,
This is true.
but why are they to an extent in students' control still?
Yeah, so I think when I talk to students sometimes about letters of recommendation, people feel really nervous about them because it's something that's going on their application that they know is really important, and that is also going to be giving a sort of more holistic view of who they are as a person that they don't get to have any control. They think they don't get to have any control over. And this is a time when I think it's really important to be thinking about sort of that same breadth versus depth like idea, but thinking about it with relationships instead of clubs. So a lot of students are like, what do I do? Do I bake my my college counselor cookies? I need to bribe them with not with money, but hopefully, but with gifts and compliments. No. What we need to do is be forming important and long-lasting relationships with the adults in your life, which is hard. I'm not trying to say this is a super easy thing, but what makes a great letter of recommendation is a really great kid, which you probably already are if you're watching this, or if you're not, who knows? You're probably great. And so you just need to show people how great you are, and you need to be forming those relationships early. And the thing is about where you are right now is that probably you're not meeting necessarily the teachers that are going to be writing your recommendations yet, but you do already know your counselor. So probably, at least. So you want to be forming that relationship in a long-term way. And if you know anything about college counselors, they almost always have a bazillion students. And so you want to be, again, differentiating yourself and making yourself a distinguished student by going to them early, talking to them about your hopes, your fears, your college goals, and talking to them about your interests, really getting into those things that are not necessarily going to be easy to work into your application in other ways, because that person's going to know you as a human being. So they're going to be able to say from an outside perspective, that's not going to sound as braggy as just saying on your application, I'm a great person. They're going to be able to show in words rather than tell that you are a great person. You came to them and you asked for their advice. You followed up on your goals. Maybe they know that you wanted to start a club and you did it. They can tell a big story about you. So that's your counselor. You're also probably going to need to have one or two college letters from teachers, and those should be core teachers from your junior year. So you have a little bit of time to think about that. Although you never know who's going to be your teacher junior year, so you should really be trying to form relationships with your teachers every year, as it says on this slide. The person that knew you since your freshman year, that's going to be the best letter ever. So for example, I had my math teacher, I had him freshman year. I did pretty well in that class. Didn't have him again sophomore year, thought I was not ever going to have him again. Surprise, I had him actually both junior and senior year. So he was able to write a really great letter about how I had really improved, because the only non-honors class I took all my whole life basically was my freshman year math class. And then I had him again for AP Calc when I was a junior. So it was a nice transition from, oh, this person got to see me grow. And it was like a nice thing that I had already had that relationship with him, so we could really grow that into a really good letter of recommendation.
That's a really nice story right before you get to talk about SAT and ACT. So thanks for that. And can you tell us now about the SATs and ACTs and what's the point of them and what should the expectations be for next year specifically?
I can indeed tell you about them. So ACT, SAT, this is something that everyone feels pretty nervous about. So if you're feeling nervous, that is because you're a human being with a brain, because it's a little nervous. But actually, it's not so scary. In fact, especially for right now, no need to be worried at all. The point of them, though, on a whole, is that colleges want to predict three things. They want to be predicting your freshman year GPA, they want to be predicting your four-year graduation rate, and they want to be predicting your retention rate, so whether or not you leave halfway through. One really good way to predict that is to predict your student success via this SAT or ACT score. And also, as Karan was saying earlier, grade inflation has really skyrocketed, especially in this past 10 years, but really since the 90s and 80s, it's even been improving since then. So this grade inflation is crazy. And as we were talking about before, all your peers have really, really excellent grades. But what has not really changed at all is test scores. So when we have these test scores and say you're getting a really great test score, that's a way to validate that those grades are like real grades, basically, and not just, oh, you showed up and you did a really good job, but maybe you weren't really paying much attention. This test score is a way to show, actually, I did in fact know my stuff. Another thing that people are asking us all the time is about test optional. The reason why grade inflation and test optional are come together is that even at schools that are test optional, we've got deans of admission saying that GPA is not so good at predicting whether or not students are going to be there because the grades are really inflated. So again, even at places that are test optional, they do really like to have a score that shows that your grades are really legit. So we can see here the Dean of Admissions at Emory saying this very same thing. So there are basically three different types of test optional policies or testing policies in general. So we've got test optional, which right now, this might be changing and nobody quite knows. Maybe there'll be a fourth option by the time you're applying because things are changing kind of rapidly. But at the moment, we've got test optional, which is most colleges at the moment. We've got test required. So this is the way that things used to be. Almost every college used to be test required, which is just what it sounds like. You must apply, you submit your test if you're going to go. There's a couple of different ways this might look. You might need to submit an ACT, SAT score. Some colleges also might accept AP scores as a substitution, but a standardized test is required. Or we've got test blind, which is again sort of what it sounds like, and this is sometimes also called score free, where you cannot submit a score at all. Even at some of these score free or test blind schools, you do need to submit a score for some types of merit aid, some scholarships, and some athletic requirements. So even at those test blind schools, sometimes you do need one, but test optional is what we get the most questions about by far, and it does mean a really different thing in different places, and it's certainly very confusing. So test optional, which I oftentimes will call TO, and it will be referred to as TO for the rest of the slides, just means the college will review your application with or without a test score. This does not mean that they will be delighted about your thing, regardless of whether or not there's a test score. So some test optional schools are not really test optional at all, such as Duke, for example, admits about 70% of their admitted students have test scores. Whereas some test optional schools, such as Pepperdine and the University of Washington, a good rule of thumb is it on the West Coast? That's probably more likely to be a real test optional school. These schools, they don't care about your test score at all. Submit it, don't submit it. It will probably still help you if you do submit it and it's really good, but it's a good way to use that common data set that Eric mentioned earlier. And that's how we'll know if it's a real test optional school or not. So the bottom line here is that a strong test score is still a really big asset to your application. And it is one of those things that is really under your control. And we really, again, we want to be holding tight to those 5 things that are under your control. So across the line, we want to be thinking the more selective that your goals are. So if you're applying to those Ivies, some of them are test required, so not even test optional at all. But even if it is one of those highly selective universities that is still test optional, you probably still want to be submitting your score. And you can always look at the common data set, even though that's a little bit behind where the times usually. It's a good way to find out, or you can always ask us. But regardless, even if you're not applying to a really selective school, having strong schools will still expand your options, especially for merit scholarships and aid. And if you're an athlete, that's another reason why you might really want to have a score, or you might even really just need a score, even if it's a test optional school. And the sort of the secondary bottom line, which I suppose means it wasn't the bottom line at all, is that obtaining that strong score does not need to be the be all end all of your life. If obtaining a strong score is going to totally drive you crazy, you're going to be distracted, and you're going to lose that very front page of your application, your grades, in the pursuit of this nearly unattainable test score for you personally. Could be attainable for some people, perhaps not for you. We don't know, especially if it's going to be really stressful. You could attain it, but you might drop down to a C in one of your classes, which would hurt your front page of your application. Don't do that. The front page is the front page. The test score validates that front page, but if the front page is no good, the test score is not going to save you necessarily. So we really want to make sure that you're not driving yourself to distraction and stress by getting a really good score, because test optional options will be available to you, almost certainly. So there are a couple of different options for what tests you can take. Well, a couple of different options being 2. The one that many of our students will take, probably at this point we're still at about half and half. But you might have just heard about the new digital SAT. which we're getting tons and tons of questions about every day. So we thought we'd just sort of lay out the differences between the two tests. So the digital SAT is still 4 sections, like you might have been familiar with before. But it does look different now, obviously because it's on a computer, but also in terms of its content slightly. So instead of having like a grammar section and a reading section, now those 2 sections are combined. So we've just got 2 verbal sections and 2 math sections. There's also quite a few fewer questions on the test than there were before. And there are some new challenges that are presented here in that there are fewer annotation tools. So obviously on a paper test, you can just sort of write all over it, particularly you can write in diagonal lines, which you certainly cannot do on the computer, etc. Also, the verbal questions are a lot more challenging on this new test, though, something that we have noticed. A lot of students are delighted by the fact there aren't any long passages, but it turns out that human brains not that great at changing tasks over and over again for 2 hours. So that might be more challenging for you. And it really just sort of depends on who you are as a person. Also, this new test is adaptive, which is kind of a little bit stressful for some students. We can see here what adaptive means, which is that it depends on how you do on that first module, what module 2 will look like. So if you score poorly or not even poorly, but just not as well on the first module, you'll be led to a slightly easier second module, which then will put a cap on how high your score at the end can be. If you score in the higher range on the first module, you'll get a more challenging second module, and your score can be in that higher range. These 2 modules do sort of meet in the middle. So if you score really well on the easier second module, you can sort of see on here, it's sort of more of a gradient. You don't really need to be too worried about the particulars of all of this. It's very easy to get carried away. It's the same as it's always been. You really want to pay attention to the question that's right in front of you and get that question right. We get a lot of questions of, frankly, conspiracy theories that the students are spreading amongst themselves, that you should be trying to get a certain number of questions wrong or something. If we think about this critically, this doesn't make a lot of sense. You want to get as many questions right as possible, and then you'll get your best score. So the other test that you can take is the ACT. The ACT is also 4 sections. The difference with scoring here is rather than being out of 1600, is out of 36. And rather than adding all the scores together, they average them out. We've got our sections that are English, math, reading, and science. And our challenges on this test are a little bit different. So this test is still paper for the time being. We have had, we're actually a member of the NTPA, the National Test Prep Association, and we're able to talk to Janet, who is the CEO of the ACT, and she has given us assurances that the test will not be going digital, like as a mandate, anytime soon or hopefully forever. But they are piloting a digital version, which might be coming soon. For the moment, still on paper. It is a much longer exam, so that timing and fatigue can be a problem for some students. And also the topics rotate a little bit more frequently on the difficult math problems, whereas on the SAT, you can kind of predict what they're going to ask you a little bit better than you can on the ACT. People are a lot of times wondering, now that we know there are 2 different tests, well, which test should I take? The good news is we can help with that. You really just want to be taking one of both and seeing how you do on either one. There's not too much rocket science involved here. We are more than happy to give you like a free no obligations diagnostic exam. We'll send you the PDFs and the instructions to take both tests. And if one test is far stronger than the other, then that's the one you prepare for. It always sounds a little strange because the tests are standardized and at the end of the day are kind of testing the same information. But we've had students that have like the equivalent, yes, like Eric, who loves to tell his very dramatic diagnostic story, which, yes, is very interesting. Eric, I don't know if you feel like describing this for us now.
Yeah, no, because I was one of those students that you were just saying, which is I grew up in Connecticut, and at the time it was just all SAT all the time, no conversation. Everyone defaulted to it. And I always tell students I was doing fine. Like it was okay, right? I was top of my class, but like okay, I was gonna have to study what else is new, right? Like everyone else. And I was on a college visit and I was speaking with an admissions representative, and she asked me, how I was doing on practice tests. I was like, okay, gonna need to work at it. She's like, have you ever heard of the ACT? I hadn't. And we still get this, not nearly as much as in the past. We've, been doing this since 2010, but now everyone knows both are options. And it's really a willingness more than anything, right? And students are like, I don't want to take a practice test of both, right? Like, I'll just try this one. It sounds better, right? Oh, I like pencil and paper. I'll just do the ACT. Or, oh, the SAT is only 2 hours now and it's on a computer. I'll just do that, right? And they make up, shortcuts to justify a decision. But trust me, it's going to save so much time, energy, money, and stress just taking both up front. Because even though, based on all stereotypes, I should have been an SAT kid, I took a practice ACT. Lo and behold, I scored close to perfect. It was like more than 200 points better than I ever done on an SAT practice test. And I took 2 practice tests on my own and was done, right? And that's obviously a very extreme case, but it doesn't matter what your starting score is. It's figuring out which test is better for you.
Yeah.
And the scores are similar. Tori and Jim and our test prep team are gonna talk with that about you and help make a plan. But if there's one test that's way better, Tori, right?
Yes.
It's
Um, and my sort of motto in general, is that more information is always better. So it's never going to have hurt you to spend that extra couple of hours and having done a diagnostic exam. I grew up in a really rural area that didn't have, like, I had never heard of the ACT, and you couldn't even take it in my state at the time. I think now you can as of like 2 years ago. Um, but it's a really great opportunity to have the chance to just sort of see what options are there. And you might find out, again, like Eric, wow, nobody around me is taking this test, but actually it's the perfect fit for me, and this is just what I ought to do. And then it's like a ton of your money that you don't have to spend on prep because or less money that you have to spend on prep. And also your students' time and vital energy they don't have to spend like bashing their head against a wall on a test that was just not meant for them. So these things are really important. More information is always better. So in terms of timeline, the backbone of both of these exams is Algebra 2 and Geometry, which you can take in either order, obviously, depending on what school you're at. And if you're in a school that has integrated math, we're more than happy to talk with you about equivalencies and everything. But basically, you want to have the topics covered in these 2 courses finished before you take your prep. So if you're going to be done by the end of 10th grade with these 2 courses, then you want to be trying to test as early as possible junior year. We do, as a general rule, recommend that you do the bulk of your prep during the summer so you're not overlapping with school and possible athletics, although that doesn't always happen, and that's totally okay. Particularly if you're taking Algebra 2 and Geometry and you're not done until middle or end of 11th grade. In that case, you want to take your first test in the spring of your junior year. You can do some more prep over the summer and then be done with testing before senior year. So it really boils down to your individual circumstances. Obviously, almost none of your students will be nearly ready to do any of this yet. But it is important to know because the PSAT, almost all students will be taking that in the fall. And a lot of students get really nervous about that. We just use that PSAT as a data point. Again, more information is always better. Almost all students do take a PSAT in the fall of their 10th grade year.
And to be clear, Tori, with the PSAT, that doesn't count for anything as a 10th grade student in colleges are never going to see that.
Nope. So that's just more information just for you. So that's not even like a more information is always better, but maybe someone's going to see it. No downside to taking the PSAT. That's just information for you and your family to work with and see sort of how you're doing. So here's on this slide about the PSAT in the fall. Additionally, in the winter or spring, depending on when you're taking your, as we were just talking about, when you're done with your Algebra 2 and Geometry, you can then take your SAT and ACT diagnostic testing. We'll be sending that out as a PDF in the email, as well as the instructions for how to take the digital SAT practice. We'll be sending all those instructions out to all the attendees. And then you can make a test prep plan before next summer. So you just want to be making a plan, but don't be too worried about anything at this point.
Now, Tori, one other thing here, and we know you're the accommodations specialist. Accommodations are something that come up a lot with regard to classes, but especially with the SAT and the ACT. Are these conversations that should be happening now in the summer, the fall? What does that look like? What are the next steps for students who need the accommodations or are in the process of deciding if they should qualify or do?
Yeah. So, if any student or if you're hearing rumblings from your teachers or if you're at home seeing the signs that accommodations might be necessary, getting that psych ed testing as soon as possible. So like this is a special evaluation that can only be done by an expert. This testing is pretty hard to get, frankly, especially just in terms of like actual availability. So getting in for that kind of testing as soon as you possibly can, if that's something that you think is going to be necessary, that is vital. Also trying to get your accommodations in place by the start of your sophomore year, or at the very least by the end of your sophomore year, makes it a lot less likely that you would need to appeal any potential accommodations to the College Board on the chance that you might need to take these exams. Also, well, because most people will need to take them. Additionally, it can be kind of annoying to get accommodations from the College Board in particular if you didn't, like if you took the PSAT in 10th grade with no accommodations and then you request accommodations in your junior year, it's still totally possible. We have people that do it every year. I personally work with many students that have that, but they are annoying about it. Everything is a lot easier in general. Just try to get that stuff done as soon as possible. Partially just because if the student needs accommodations, they almost certainly also need them in their courses. So you want to make sure that you have those just because they're good to have, and if you need them, you need them. But also it's just going to be a lot more headache, a lot more possible appeals, etc. the later that you wait to get those done.
Story.
So how can we help? You can schedule a meeting with Jim, who is the director of everything here. But he runs all of the test prep and is my boss. You can schedule a meeting with him during your sophomore year and have like all of your questions answered and map out a plan that specifically fits your students' needs, because as Eric was saying earlier, people admit people. Your students are just individual people. They might have different needs depending on who they are. So make sure that you make that kind of meeting early. That initial consultation is free, as is the whole diagnostic process. So up until you start tutoring with us, there aren't any costs associated with that.
Thanks, Tori. That was awesome and totally not painful at all. That was completely painless. And now we know everything we need to know. And really it's interesting with the test optional. It is rapidly evolving year to year. Even in the past couple months, it's changed. So one thing we would say right now is don't start analyzing or over analyzing which colleges do or do not have test optional policies or test required. It's just going to be much better for your stress level. And quite frankly, there's no benefit to tracking it now unless you're just genuinely interested in that type of thing. Things are going to change. We don't know how they're going to change, but things are going to change. Maybe a little, maybe a lot, but a year from now, it's going to be different. And a year after that, it'll be different when your students are actually applying. So you can monitor it. Trust me, we'll be monitoring it. And, we do webinars all year long, trying to keep people up to date on things. But yeah.
Just a little funny anecdote is that we had an AP webinar a couple of months, well, I guess last month at this point. We were talking about what schools take AP exams, etc. Literally the next morning, multiple colleges that were like, we'll take AP exams instead of ACT scores. And we were like, you couldn't have said this 1 hour ago. Like, are you kidding me? So truly, we are huge dorks about this stuff. We pay attention to it, some might say obsessively. Jim and I are texting about it at all hours of the day. And even us, we're still getting it rapid fire all the time. and sometimes it messes up our AP webinar. So when we say don't bother tracking it until it matters to you, really don't bother tracking it until it matters to you, because it matters to us all the time and we still don't always know what's going on. So make sure that you're like, just don't worry about it. It's gonna be
Maybe
okay.
just manifested someone else changing their policy first thing tomorrow morning. So we'll see. Speaking of that, because of, building your college list and thinking about that. So these last 2 points of the college list and essays, we'll just mention briefly, kind of looking ahead. It's worth noting this idea that you're going to start building your college list, because some families of sophomores, and even right after freshman year, you have the summer, maybe there's not a lot of plans, and you say, look, let's take a trip, right? Let's do a family road trip, or let's fly somewhere in the country. And while we're at wherever we're at, let's maybe check out some schools and step on campus. Just remember, there are thousands of colleges and universities across the country. It's going to feel perhaps a bit overwhelming to start, and planning where you want to travel to, or imagining where you may want to live for the next 4 years, that could be a great place to go as you're thinking about what colleges you may want to visit this summer or during the course of next year, just to start investigating, checking things out. Look, it's okay to be superficial, right? With so many schools out there, you got to start limiting them down somehow. And college isn't just a school, it's about finding your home for the next 4 years too. So this can be a very, very low-key thing looking at colleges. It's going to feel emotional, especially if this is your first time as a parent taking your child. Wow, my child's old enough to start looking at colleges. That's going to be emotional. And it's going to feel big for your student too, because the second they step foot on campus, things do feel a little bit more real. But for families who start now, right, and don't do it from a place of intensity, but just curiosity and easing into it in the summer and the fall, look, let's have some fun, right? What are some, you want to live in a city? Do you want to check out this part of the country, this type of environment? It's a good way to go. And just down the road, think you want to end up applying to probably 10 schools, give or take, these days. You'll hear people talk about that traditional balance list of 3 reaches, 3 targets, 3 likelies. It's a longer conversation for another day. You definitely want 2 to 3 likely schools on your list. But most of all, you want your student applying to places where they truly can envision themselves being happy and thriving and successful academically, socially, personally, emotionally, in all facets of their life. So these are conversations you don't need to have now in like huge intensity and depth, but starting to have open, frank conversations, putting out parameters, right? Like my parents said, you're not getting on a plane to go to college. Knowing that early on helped set my expectations so that there was really never any resentment or arguments about that. And then I got to make my needs and desires known as well, right? I was raised in a pretty rural town and very woodsy, and I'm a huge sports fan. And I said, look, I may not be getting on a plane, but I'm only going to college in a city with professional sports teams. And that was really, really important to me. And that was the starting point for us to start visiting schools. And when we went to baseball games across the Northeast, that was a great excuse to visit campuses, whether students were in session or not. And it was awesome. So have some fun with it, the next year. That's a great what's next step to ease into it. And down the road, we are here for students and work with them on college essays and applications. This is not something to worry about during the sophomore year, right? It's something that we start meeting with students about in November of junior year. But, and then build up to the best time to really write college essays is during the summer between junior and senior year. We coach students throughout the essay process, start to finish. We have an incredible team that's providing unlimited support, meetings, feedback, being the project managers, the coaches, the counselors, the support systems, the cheerleaders from start to finish, from brainstorming to drafting, revising, finalizing all the essays and applications, and we're here to bring out the student's voice and authenticity. We really start early in junior year so we can build close relationships where we earn students' trust so that they're more willing to open up to us, because really they're not just opening up to us, ultimately, they're opening up to the admissions officers who will be reading their applications. So getting students to feel comfortable, open up, share their stories, and really learn to embrace themselves and who they are and what's important to them and what values and insights they want to share is something we love to do. So, in conclusion, freshman year is coming to a close. Finish in the home stretch strong with your grades, right? Fourth quarter, second semester, finals, this is it, right? Um, just gas out, finish strong. Summer's almost here. On the horizon, make a plan for SAT and ACT prep. It's going to be simmering a little bit in the fall between PSATs, but take those diagnostics probably in the winter and talk with us. We'd love to help build a plan together. Talk with a family and explore extracurricular interests and really start building out that plan as well. Get rid of things that don't bring your student fulfillment or purpose or joy, and really start deep diving into what's meaningful and finding different ways to integrate it in your student's life and do it in meaningful ways. And that's something we would love to talk about. And you can consider a personal advising meeting with us really anytime. Next couple of weeks heading into the summer, especially if you don't have summer plans yet still. And during the summer and in the early fall, it's kind of a back to school thing, and just get everyone on the same page with a good plan looking forward. So thank you for joining us all. We really appreciate you all coming out, and we will take some time for Q&A that Karan will read. So if you haven't already, you're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A section. We'll do those, and then thank you to everyone who's here, and have a great night. But in the meantime, Karan, what do we got?
So a couple, obviously continue to put them in if you do have any questions, but the first one that came in was for probably Tori, I'd say. And Tori, can applying test optional hurt you when you apply to a test optional school?
So this is kind of a complicated question because it really does depend on the college. But I really like to think of it as sort of a big pie. If you take away a big piece of the pie, that piece of the pie is not magically filled in with anything. So it's not that necessarily the rest of the pie is worse. It's just that there is less pie there. So if the rest of everything, like all your grades, your extracurricular, I cannot speak. If your grades, your extracurriculars are great, you took a bunch of APs, you're delighted, you're wonderful, you have a great essay. Those things just need to sparkle even more than they already were going to, basically. So it's not necessarily that it's going to hurt you. It's that you'll really need to have excelled in the other areas, sort of to make up for not having that piece of the pie that you've not included in your application.
I think it's worth noting, and just quickly building off that admissions officers will say that it's not going to hurt you.
Yes, certainly.
But I think to Tori's point, and this is what they're not saying, is it's not helping you either.
Yes.
So the
You've got
pie,
an empty pie piece where otherwise there would be pie.
yeah. I mean, the pie analogy I love, but as a sports fan, I always joke, if the Eagles miss the field goal, they don't lose 3 points, but you don't get them either. So
Yeah,
it's not hurting you, it's not helping you.
indeed.
Yeah.
This one's for Eric. How do colleges view summer programs?
Boy. Um, that wouldn't be my first choice if I'm cultivating activities that I'm trying to make myself distinguished, or if I'm trying to find activities that will distinguish me from other applicants, summer programs are not what I'm going to default and run to. Summer programs can be great, especially if they are related to academic topics that a student isn't going to have access and exposure to in their school curriculum. This could be a great opportunity for them, for a student who may want to consider applying business or engineering, for instance, and their high school doesn't have classes in those fields. And you need to know going into the application process if you are going to apply as an engineer or a business student. Summer programs can give you some clarity on that point. But other than that, yeah, I mean, is it a nice experience to live on a college campus and meet diverse people? Absolutely. Is it going to distinguish you? No, I'd love to see something that's more personally identifying and illuminating. And that can be anything during the summer. So,
And it also really does depend on what kind of summer program it is. So if it's at least when I've heard from both you guys and some other people that if the program reaches out to you, that's a different thing than if you reach out to the program. So if it's something like Governor's School, or if it's something like in New Hampshire, we have this program where only 2 kids get to go from each high school, and it's a whole thing where you get invited. That's going to look really different than a pay-to-play program. So it really depends on, much like all the other things we talked about today, depends on the individual person and the individual program rather than what's going on.
And then so just to answer kind of a more general question, if you do have questions about your own particular situation, feel free to email us after this webinar at that info at, and we can shoot that information to you about your particular situation as well. So if it's not something you feel comfortable asking in this group setting, email us and we can follow, or give us a call and we can follow up it via kind of the appropriate channel. So that's it on the Q&A part as well. So Eric, do you want to wrap us up?
yeah, thank you to everyone for joining. You can see our contact information here. Don't hesitate to email or call anytime, and you're welcome to share this webinar with friends. We love putting out good information and educating and empowering families, and we're excited to hopefully speak to your family and students soon. So thanks for joining us, and have a wonderful night, everyone.
See y'all. Have a good night. Bye-bye.